Oh, okay. We are now live. There's Senator Chisholm. Miss you.
What happened?
I hope you're feeling better. Okay. All right.
Oh,
Well, two of you were out and I was sitting next to both of you yesterday. But this is at the moment a greatly diminished Senate Finance. We have a quorum. Senator Chittenden is on. I'm assuming the rest of my committee will be coming in, but we are 5 minutes late, so we are starting because we do have a quorum. So, Patrick, today we just got, you're going to give us instructions on income tax, right?
Instructions.
Well, information.
Hey, I like that better.
Okay. I've been told that I am anti-funding schools on income tax, and I said, no, we have worked on it. And so far, the numbers haven't worked. So we're going to take another look today and see basics of income tax and then move it forward.
oh, this is fun. I mean it. I'm not being sarcastic.
All right. Well, I am Patrick Jinton. I am with the Joint Fiscal Office. I really appreciate the enthusiasm to learn about income taxes. I don't always get that kind of reaction from people.
This is the finance committee.
I know.
I don't think
surprised.
this side of the room is anti-learning tab on income tax.
Well, I won't hold it against
We
you,
like
I
to
guess.
learn.
I'm not sure where they are. I know we have one sick today. He is on.
So I guess actually let me back up for a sec. There's two documents that should be under my name on the website. The one I'm going to start with is personal income taxes and income distribution overview. I know everyone in this room has been on either on a finance or a ways and means committee or so I can kind of cruise through some of the first stuff. I was going to talk about basically how they work, and then get into some sort of history, talking about I'll just go here, how they work. Some history on like recent legislative changes, and then
Okay, no, I think that
okay.
never hurts to
And then we'll look at
remind us.
the income tax by the numbers and some income tax like distribution of income, so you can kind of get a better visualization of who pays. Don't be daunted if you look at the two presentations put together. It's like over 60 slides. We'll kind of go fast in some parts and slower in other parts and see what we get through today. So just right off the bat, I want to kind of start with where does the state even start with personal income taxes? So we do use the federal definition of AGI as a starting point. So that's everything from your wages, tips, salaries. If you have a pass-through entity that you receive income through, those of that. So basically any kind of income you can think of kind of gets built into AGI.
And that's adjusted gross income for anyone that's listening on the screen.
Thank you.
And we start with the federal AGI, that line on your federal tax, right?
Yep. So the Vermont Tax Department, first place they start, they come to this form when you report it, but it's the same calculation that builds into this form. So we're coupled in this instance. So you'll see within the Vermont Tax Code, there's a lot of places where we're coupled with the feds and a lot of places where we decided if we want to do our own thing. We'll do some of those things. But I just want to start with like a flow chart. So like I said, we start with the 1040 federal form. That's our gross adjusted gross income. Vermont, in this first instance here, we can make a couple of alterations to that definition. We add that bonus depreciation. We add that interest non-Vermont state and local bonds. So those are the additions that we make to that calculation. And then there's some other adjustments where we're actually subtracting out income from that definition that are this is where we start to get into sort of the decoupling and from the feds. So in Vermont, we've got a standard deduction that comes right out of AGI. We've got however many personal exemptions you have, that gets pulled right out. And then I've got 4 examples here, but these are just 4 other deductions or subtractions we make. You'll see, for example, medical expenses, Vermont Social Security exemption is on there. So once we make those additions, then our subtractions through those exemptions and deductions, we get to the Vermont taxable income. Which is sort of where we start on this slide. So Vermont, like the feds and most other states, we've got different brackets based on your filing status. We've got married filing jointly, separately, head of household, single people, and they each individually have their own marginal tax rate or tax schedule. And I'm sure if you want me to like level of detail of explaining things like what's a marginal rate.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
we should go, always refresh. We have not done this year. I don't know if we did this last year, so.
So a marginal rate, so I guess I'll use Massachusetts as the example. Prior to their new millionaire's tax, they just had a flat 4%. Everyone's taxed at the same rate, no matter how much income you have. They also obviously have other credits and exemptions that apply, but they just have the one flat rate. There's no income tax rate schedule. In Vermont, we've got a graduated calendar where if we just use the this bracket here in the top left quadrant, so any income for a single individual between 0 and $48,000, that's taxed at a rate of 3.35%. The next bracket goes from 47,900 up to 116,000. So everything below 47,000, that's getting taxed at the lower rate. By moving into that second bracket, you're not actually taxing everything at that with a graduated rate of 6.6%. It's only within that range that's taxed. So when we talk about someone earning $1 million, we're reporting that much. They're going to be going through all of these different brackets. And their
You
lowest
pay
income.
that bracket, you pay on that section of your income, you pay that percentage
Exactly.
in there, and the higher amount is only on the higher amount of your income.
Yep. So in this example, if we're saying $1 million, everything above 242,000 would be taxed at that highest rate of 8.75. And it's only that income just above that range. So just to jump back, so we're at the Vermont taxable income. We go through these brackets depending on your filing status. Then you get your initial Vermont tax liability. And this is where we'll start to get into things like credits. So we've gone through the tax brackets. We have our initial tax liability, but Vermont, for various purposes, has all kinds of credits that we provide people to encourage certain activity, provide financial support for certain things. And so the first thing that we do is remove the refundable credits. In the next slide, I'll just quickly define what I mean when I say refundable and non-refundable. So we first take out the non-refundable credits, then you take out your refundable credits. And you actually have to multiply that then by the Vermont apportionment percentage, because not everyone lives here 12 months of the year. So really, it's just giving you credit for the months that you're in state, because we can't tax people from Texas if they don't live here, right? So yeah, once you put all those pieces together, you actually get your final Vermont tax liability or refund, because with the credits, this can end up being either you owe the state or the state owes you money. And so I said I was going to define these. So there's I want to sort of split up the tax breaks that the state gives people into two sort of broader buckets. We have our exemptions and deductions. This happens basically before we get to the point where we're sending your income through all the tax buckets. So it's reducing the reported income, which then sort of indirectly will affect the person's tax liability after going through the brackets.
Standard deduction.
Yep. And I've got a list of a bunch of examples that the state has on the books on the next slide. Credits on the other hand, dollar for dollar, you go through that whole process and you get to their tax liability, and whatever the value of the credit is, dollar for dollar, reduces that liability amount. So it's a much more direct way and, quite frankly, smaller sort of dollar wise credit amounts can quickly become more expensive than sort of higher dollar value exemption amounts.
Because if your credit is more than you owe, then you get a check, right, from the state.
Yeah, and also just the fact that it's dollar for dollar rather than the sort of indirect effect of an exemption. So refundable. This basically just means that if your tax bill is less than the amount of the credit or credits you're eligible to receive, you can get the difference back in a refund. So just a quick numbers example there is if you have a tax liability of $100 and you're eligible for and claim a $200 refundable credit, your tax liability gets wiped out to zero. But then the balance of that is $100. So the state will actually send you that refund for $100. Whereas with the non-refundable, there's no money back in your pocket. You wipe out the $100 of tax liability and you get no check. So non-refundable, less potential for growing to be really expensive because it's really limited by the tax filer's income that they're reporting. And typically credits, whether they're refundable or not, tend to have income thresholds which target sort of lower income earners. So often they don't have a lot of time.
The biggest.
Yes, and actually I'll show you earned income tax credit. This is from the most recent tax expenditure report. Even with the child tax credit, which is relatively new, earned income tax credit is still the most expensive tax expenditure of the state. You'll see a little note there that this doesn't include the standard deduction or personal exemptions. I kind of view those more as like adjustments based on family configuration that we make, as opposed to giving tax credits to people. It's really just more of a, what's your living situation? You think that should kind of affect, what you owe the state. Because two people living together, a married couple living together without kids is a slightly different financial situation. I say slightly, than a married couple living together with 3 kids, Yeah, overall, there's about $100 million in tax expenditures. This is really just revenue that the state is foregoing. In some ways, it's kind of like an appropriation because the purpose of a lot of these is to provide financial.
Across the hall, it is an appropriation.
I always try to walk that fine line between the two committees. But yeah, so about $100 million. So you can see that there's a lot of adjustments that the state has sort of gone and proactively said we want to support this kind of behaviors or responsibilities that people might have. But just to come back one slide, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. I've got a list of a bunch of exemptions and credits. These are all included in the tax expenditure report. If you want to look a little more deeply into how much some of these are costing the state every year. But I just want to show you.
Half of these. Someday it'd be interesting to go. Starkville. Are those all state or those federal?
These are all state. Some of them are tied pretty closely to federal.
Because I knew federal had a very nice historic rehabilitation tax credit. Okay.
And I'll also point out, these are just the exemptions and deductions and credits that have a statutory purpose. There's a bunch of credits, not all income tax, obviously, but that are in sort of session law. That they might have a sunset or they just don't have a statutory purpose, which means they don't end up in the tax expenditure report because we only score the things with statutory purposes. Basically they're in statute, so they're permanent, right?
I know research and development has come up for question on more than one occasion. Facade improvement tax credit.
Yeah, are these personal income tax credits or are these, because how,
So the facade, code improvement and historic rehabilitation, those three are actually all sort of rolled up in the downtown and village tax credit program, right? And so there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of ways. So typically what'll happen is a developer will apply for them, they'll shoot for credit. They have the option of either claiming that credit themselves on their own income tax liability, or if they want capital for the project to do it, they'll actually go and sell it to a bank or an insurance company. So they do have the option to claim it themselves. Well, but often what we do see is they sell it for 90 cents on the dollar, something like that, to a bank, and they claim it against their bank franchise tax. So
right?
Yeah,
it is available to them.
Right, and the charitable housing and affordable housing credits and the mobile home park credits, are those the same kind of thing as well? Or-
No, those are not part of the,
I think someday we'll take an afternoon and go
Yeah.
through those.
because we,
Just, I mean, we go through the tax expenditures on an annual, I mean, we do one a year, kind of thing usually. And we don't usually make any changes, but some of it would just be interesting to, at some point, when you have nothing else to do, and we don't either, to go through those and, just see what they are and make sure they all are incenting something that we would like to incent right now. And how much money we're giving up incenting something we may or may not want to incent. It may happen without our incentive, so, which is always the question. Would it happen if we incented or didn't incent?
and I'll say a couple of things about, this is not an exhaustive list, even just of personal income taxes, but when you look at the report, you'll see that some of these aren't necessarily claimed every year, or the money that's being foregone is very small. And I'll also say that this is just the personal income tax list here. This pales in comparison to the number of exemptions we have in sales and use. Again, another one where a lot of the numbers are very small, but you also have numbers that are really big, like the groceries exemption in that space. But sticking to personal income taxes, this is sort of, this pie chart it's just showing you the cost of sort of all the things that we can measure with statutory purposes. And this is just basically $100 million the state's not collecting and can't spend on other priorities, but it's determined that supporting these areas is a priority for the state. So,
And at least, when we redid the tax code, we got a lot of feedback and concern on charitable tax credit. I didn't hear anything on the medical expense deduction until the next year when people realized put one in. So it still is on the federal, but it wasn't on ours, so we have put one. We did. After the first tax cut job bill, one, state of Vermont, through that tax cut bill, gained $30 million. And there was a feeling that if we were going to increase people's taxes by $30 million, we should do it deliberately. So we went back and rewrote the tax code. So that the goal was, there were always a few glitches that didn't work out, that people ended up paying the same thing they would have if there had been no tax cut and jobs built to the state of Vermont. These were federal tax cuts, but we tried to make ours new. So these things have all been recently redone.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You may have said this and I missed it, but do we have any way of measuring the efficacy or the effect that these tax cuts have, or is there a way Are Vermonters good about communicating to the administration? I'm just wondering, is there a measure at all of what they do?
Like a performance audit.
Yeah, sure.
So we don't do it for every single one, but up until 2 years ago, before the session law and the report ran out, we had been writing something. So there's the tax expenditure report, which I've been talking about. We also used to write something called the tax expenditure reviews report. And actually 2 years ago, I wrote a report on the EITC, sort of looking at who is this affecting, how is it affecting them, what areas are we succeeding with this credit, and what areas could it maybe be improved. And so
Well, that would be something for us to go over. So,
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
sure. A couple years prior to that, Grant Campbell wrote one about the downtown and village tax credit
Yes.
program.
remember that.
And so that's not part of this year's, because like, basically it was written into session law that we go through, I think, 5 or 6 different like types of credit. And once we had reviewed everything, it essentially ran out. I mean, at this point, we could do it again, but it's just updating old information. And, there's not necessarily always new revelations with just updating old information. Yeah, I mean, there's a few reports that I'd be happy to send. There's other things like, including those reports like the exemption on clothing.
That was part of the- Yeah, well, we could tax all clothing. But we used to accept clothing over $100 to $200 an item, to make it less regressive.
And there are a few neighboring states who have that.
Yeah, we found out that
Massachusetts, yeah.
streamlined sales tax told us it was all or nothing
Right.
when it
They
first
changed their
started.
tune.
They have changed their tune. I gather they wanted Rhode Island more than us. And we did discuss last year, but it wasn't a lot of money putting that back in. And that's an option that is out there again. I think the number's up to $200 an item, but I can dress a family very well for under $100 an item.
Well, if you're interested in hearing more about that, I'm sure we could get Ted.
But before we leave here, we may. Okay.
So your initial comments were really well timed, because next I wanted to talk about some recent legislative changes, both federally and at the state. It's a little bit of a history lesson, but it gets to an important point that I want you all to keep in mind as things are evolving.
I was right. We really voted 18.
So Tax Cut and Jobs Act had there were specifically 2 really big impacts on, the Vermont perspective for income tax collection. There's obviously some other things that affected Vermonters' tax payments at the federal level, like state and local tax cap, and a few other things. But just looking at it from the perspective of Vermont revenue perspective, so the Tax Cut and Jobs Act eliminated personal exemptions. Prior to that, Vermont had just, was part of the tax, miscellaneous tax bill, the link up, just whatever the feds are using this year, let's use them. They eliminated that in this bill. And also what they did was they took the standard deduction and increased it significantly. I think basically the point of that was they wanted to make it, they wanted fewer people to be itemizing. They just wanted the standard deduction to sort of help streamline the process. But if you look at it in a vacuum, eliminating personal exemptions would have had an upward effect on Vermont personal income tax revenue, but then increasing the standard deduction so much would have had a downward pressure, because you're removing one exemption, but then you're increasing another exemption, which in the slides above, you remember that basically pulls and pushes the
It's a balloon.
yeah, basically it pushes and pulls the income that eventually flows through the brackets. And so why this is, so at the time, this was important. There was some uncertainty about what the income distributional effects of this would look like. Obviously by removing personal exemptions, large families would probably get dinged more by this. But then again, does the big increases in the standard deduction, does that offset that? So what is interesting about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is that the personal income tax provisions in that bill are set to expire at the end of this year. You'll see that in the personal income tax world, the existing changes expiring won't affect us too much. And I'll show you what that looks like, but because it's part of a reconciliation process, Bird rule can increase the federal deficit by a certain amount over a 10-year period. Act 11, which we'll talk about next, was sort of the direct response that Vermont had to this. So given the uncertainty with the elimination of the exemptions and the increase of the standard deduction, some of you all, and maybe some of your predecessors, decided to, well, let's take what the federal exemptions and standard deductions were at the time and just set that in Vermont statute, and we'll grow it by CPI every year, like they had been doing at the federal level previously. So whereas before it was just sort of an annual link up as part of the miscellaneous tax bill that you updated these amounts, now it's actually in Vermont statute. And that was, I think at the time, to preserve some consistency, just to make it sort of a smoother transition. Because like I said, changing around these exemptions and the deduction amount really would have had sort of net positive for some people, but a hit for other people. During that time, you used to have an extra bracket. They actually collapsed the top two brackets and set them equal to that new top rate of 8.75. And then some of the lower brackets, those rates were actually reduced by a little bit. So maybe you know more of the history on this than me, Madam Chair, but that probably owing to the fact that there's $30 million.
But the other, when we did the original Blue Ribbon Tax Commission, their goal was to make Vermont more competitive, or just look at our tax code, because every national standard would do that top tax rate, the top margin, and rate us terribly, like that's what got taxed. And at that time, we had tried the House. I know Representative Ansel at that point worked diligently, and Senator Beck may have been there, trying to find a way to do that without negatively, and this was just as the Great Recession was hitting, and we're trying to collapse that top bracket and not negatively impact middle class taxpayers, because we were in a recession, and they weren't able to. It was kind of like our trying to find a way to do income taxes instead of property taxes without negatively impacting the lower brackets. And we couldn't. When this happened, we were able to do that. But it has been frequently talked about putting that top bracket back in, and that started at 328,000, or was it higher than that?
I have to go back.
But putting that fifth bracket back in when people talk about taxing the rich, because $200,000 per couple is comfortable, but probably not rich by today's standard. But that's, we had been trying for a couple of years to collapse those brackets.
Yeah, so a couple other sort of significant changes as part of Act 11. This is when this is not the most recent, but at the time, the EITC was increased from 32% of the federal credit amount to 36% of the credit amount. Basically just meaning if you get $100 from this credit at the federal level, you get $36 from it on your tax return. So basically Vermont hasn't created its own structure for determining eligibility. It's just simpler for the tax department to say, go grab this number, it's this percent of that number. And also, I guess the other sort of significant thing here, this is the first year that the state-specific exemption for Social Security income was introduced. At the time, if you were single, it was you get the full amount exempted if you're earning less than 45,000. If you're married, 60,000 or below. And then it's got a tail, $10,000 phase out, where just using the single person as the example, by the time you're earning 55,000, you can't exempt any of the income on the state level. And actually, I'm going to be in tomorrow to talk about the governor's proposal, right? And
Yes,
so I've
that's
actually,
right.
tomorrow we'll go a little deeper into how that works. I've got a kind of flow chart from how that starts at the federal level and flows all the way through to Vermont. So that was Act 11. A little more recently in 2022, you had Act 38. This is where that child tax credit was first introduced. Basically, and actually we've talked about the same income range with unpaid caregivers bill that that I've been in here on. Basically you get $1,000 per eligible child. They have to be ages 5 or under. And if you're making $125,000 or less, you get that full amount per child. And then 50,000 phase out range. Basically, by the time you get to 175,000, no more eligibility. We've talked about this income range, right? If you look at the whole universe of Vermont taxpayers, resident filers, up to 120 or 175,000, that's about 90% of all tax filers in the state. So it's very broad in terms of the number of people who are at least income eligible.
Right. And this was tied with during the pandemic, the child tax credit had been increased, it doubled at the federal level. It was phasing out or going away as we put state one in. My memory is serving me correctly.
Yeah, and so actually on that exact point, this third bullet here, you actually again increase the percent for the EITC from 36 to 38%. And actually, interestingly, and maybe we can go a little deeper on this if you want me back on that particular credit, but if you look at the 2021 tax returns, the Fed's made a bunch of changes to the eligibility and maximum credit amount that single people without kids could receive. And, you know, you can actually just looking at the data, see how that big bump out went right through into Vermont tax returns because we're a percent of the federal amount. So if they make any changes, they flow right through into Vermont. So that was increased actually right on the heels of those results. So, you know, it's something the legislature has identified and increased on 3 different occasions in the past, I don't know, 8-ish years, 10 years. Also in that, the child care credit was expanded to make it both refundable and equal to 72%. I think prior it had been non-refundable and maybe like 36% or something like that of the federal credit amount. So pretty significant. Yeah. There are new deductions for things like student loan interest, and then $10,000 worth of military and civil service retirement income, and also the income thresholds for Social Security were bumped out of $5,000 at that time as well. And again, actually on a few of these, I know there's some governor recommended proposals that I'll be talking about tomorrow. We can go into more detail on. So I wanted to make this slide sort of as big and loud as possible because I want you to sort of have it in the back of your brains as things are being reported out in Washington. You know, as of Tax Cut and Jobs Act, you know, there were some pretty big state responses
Yeah.
to basically either smooth what was happening or deaden some of the impacts of certain policy changes. And like I said, those are expiring at the end of this year. And you know, I've heard things like fully at the federal level exempting social security income or not taxing tips or overtime, anything like that that can sort of redefine something like AGI, for example, which is our starting point. You know, again, we're talking about something that could flow right through into the state and have an impact.
So probably the best thing we can hope for is that they can't reach agreement and just continue the Tax Cut and Job Act, because we've adjusted for that.
What you can be sure of is they will make the decision exactly after we've communicated to the payroll software companies. That's what you can be sure of.
And exactly for the tax, exactly too late for the tax department to update quick.
Well, they-
No, I don't want to go through the COVID where we're
Oh, that was
going
brutal.
back to, you know, last year's
Yeah.
forms, and they were making changes to last
Oh.
year in this year.
That's where Craig Bolio lost all his hair.
Is it?
That's what happened for that.
It was pretty bad. So yeah, let's just hope that they, that all they do is continue it. Maybe. If they have to do anything, but yeah, next year could make this year look like a picnic. And it's, yeah, it's not partisan, both parties have dealt us some challenges in playing with the tax codes. Well, that's,
All right, so we've gone through basic structure, and we've talked about some recent legislative changes. One other thing I was told would be of interest is both sort of what context does this tax type have within state government and who's paying it, right? So first I want to start with just the context of how important this tax type is to Vermont state government. You know, over time, it's been increasingly, it's just been an increasing portion of the overall general fund revenue. You know, back in 2005, kind of for a little under half, but you know, by most recently, it's up over, you know, almost 55%. So that's a 7% increase in sort of the importance of this tax type in the broader context of the
and the
general fund.
money, this is the main funder for the general fund.
Mhm.
This is where the money to run everything other than education
Right.
is coming from.
And if you know, expand it a little bit to just talk about income tax in general to include corporate, you're approaching 65% of, I don't have the corporate figures here, but those two put together are 65, you know, almost 2/3 of general fund obligations are funded by this type of revenue. So I just say it's good context to have because it is an important source of revenue to fund, you know, general service to the state. And so the next thing to look at is just sort of thinking about how we compare regionally. You know, like I said, we've got the income tax brackets here, and I'm comparing it to the top marginal rates in some of our surrounding states. Interestingly here, you know, it kind of looks like we're about middle of the pack, maybe slightly on the higher end of the top marginal rate, but that really doesn't tell the full picture. It really doesn't tell the whole picture, because if you look in this column here, you can see that it varies pretty wildly where that top marginal rate kicks in from state to state. And this is kind of just reference. Again, it doesn't tell the full picture. It's just the top marginal rate in every state. They've got different exemptions and bracket structures. So what I want to sort of highlight on this slide here is basically just that looking at the top marginal rate doesn't tell the full picture. And this is before accounting for any kind of exemptions, deductions, credits, any other kind of adjustments to income the state makes. This is just a graph showing how the brackets in each of our sort of neighboring states changes as you go up in income. You can see on the low end of the spectrum, Vermont has one, you know, we're second lowest in our lowest marginal rate. But you can see here that our top marginal rate, you know, relative to some other states, does kick in at maybe a slightly lower income amount. You know, what did I say? It was 200 and something thousand for the top marginal rate to kick in for, I think it was single people. But you can see that in Massachusetts, you know, they might be higher overall, but their top marginal rate's not kicking in until $1 million. It's what I call the millionaire's tax there. So, but I'll even say that this still doesn't really tell the full picture, because what's lost in this is any other differences between states in terms of adjustments made to income. And that goes back, it's like I was saying, to deductions, exemptions, credit. Every state kind of has a whole different portfolio of what they provide, and they can change sort of the tilt of progressivity or regressivity.
I think I'm remembering back to the original Blue Ribbon that some of these states only, they say you can do like a standard deduction. You can do 1% or you can do $1,000. Whereas when we were there, we were still doing the itemized deductions. And I think one of the recommendations was that we do away with the itemized deductions, which we essentially have and did. But I think it was Rhode Island and Massachusetts, or maybe both, just had a standard deduction, so we've gotten there.
Yeah.
And we started out, so no,
Increase.
somebody is slightly below us.
Yeah, that's oh, I guess I should have said Vermont on this chart is green.
Yes,
That light blue line there, that's Connecticut.
okay.
And I've mentioned Massachusetts before, that's that red line.
So we are kinder to more of our lower income people in the tax rates. Places like Massachusetts with a flat tax, or the lower taxes, the higher taxes start at a much lower rate than ours do. No one else keeps so many people so low. I'm reading that correct.
Yeah, I mean, you can see, I guess, just to keep picking on Massachusetts here, you can see that all the way in the low end of the spectrum here, you know, 5%, that's where our bracket's at, like 3.35%. So it is hitting some of the lower income people higher, but
Maine is even worse.
yeah, but you know, also there's differences at that end of the income spectrum in terms of what credits are being provided. So what I want to show.
That's what we don't know, is what credits are in there that can offset that higher rate.
And it was a little while ago, maybe let's see, even 10 years ago. I think Deb Brighty did sort of a comparison between different states and actually took into account, it's a big effort to look at all this, but all of a few surrounding states credits and exemptions and things like that, and basically built this chart that you see in front of you here
Okay.
to look at what actual effective tax rates are for people at different income levels. So the way to interpret this here is if you're earning between $0 and $5,000, that's this point all the way here. I realized I was pointing with my pen and not the mouse. This 5,000 and under income range, that you can see they actually have a negative effective tax rate, meaning, and by negative, that means they're getting money back from the state through some sort of credit, right? And really, it's not until you get into the 25 plus range where you see any kind of positive effective tax rate. And when I say effective tax rate, we talked earlier about what a marginal rate structure is, right? The effective tax rate is, let's take just your total tax liability and divide that by your income. So it's kind of like the average rate you're paying and everything. Yeah, so you can see like the average effective tax rate in Vermont is about 3.8%. And you know, you don't sort of hit that average until you're moving along the income spectrum until you get to about the $150+ of income. That's when you sort of become an above average taxpayer, in terms of, how much you're paying, not in terms of quality of person or anything.
No judgment.
Yeah, right.
And you don't even pay until you hit 25,000.
Right. So all those people below that, they're getting some sort of financial assistance
Right.
specifically through the tax code.
Through the tax code, that doesn't
Right.
count if you're getting SNAP benefits or,
Senator Chittenden has a question.
Oh, Senator Chittenden has a question. Tom, we can't see you, so you will have to holler.
Thank you. Patrick, do you know of a chart, this effective personal income tax rate, which overlays our neighbors as well? So the previous one had just the effective rate, just the actual tax rate, but not the effective rate. Do you have any of these with all the states?
I've got an old one. That's the chart I was talking about earlier that I believe it was Deb Brighton had compiled. So it's a little old. And there's been, we talked about some of those 2022 changes, for example, that kind of changes the tax picture in Vermont a little bit. But I don't remember if I have it in this slide or another one, but I can send you that chart definitely.
I know it is for New Hampshire.
Thanks.
It's different. That's
Don't
what
talk
it is.
about it. It's like Chittenden County.
The exact same, but
Yeah,
different places we do.
Okay,
Well, they've got the dividends and interest and that whole thing, although they're talking about phasing it out. So it'd be
okay.
interesting to see what happens to their budget. Yeah. So this makes sense to everyone. We can move to something that's kind of showing a similar thing a different way. This is just looking at the number, in those blue columns, you got the number of returns that are in these buckets. And in the orange, you've got the amount of taxes paid. So I struggle forever to get the scaling on these two axes right. So hopefully you can see the distinction here, but there's about 90,000 tax returns that actually have a slightly negative, when you put them all together, a negative tax liability. So they might be getting a little bit from the state, or they might be getting a good amount from the state, but this bucket of almost 90,000 tax returns actually are getting money on aggregate back from the state. And just as you move to the right on the bars in the chart, you see the number of people going up in these income buckets. People over $300,000. There's a little over 9,000 of these tax filers, but they're paying a much larger share of overall taxes
I had heard
to the state.
at one point that like 10% of the taxpayers contributed 50% of the state revenue. That, okay.
There you go.
They're going.
You're prescient as always. So we've got around, we got about 1,000 people earning over $1 million who are paying about 20% of total collections. If you expand that to 500 and up, it's about, what is that, 3,500 filers paying about 30%.
1% pay 30%.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so in that top tax bracket, the 200 to 299, we're pretty close to, we are at 50% or better.
So,
The top tax bracket is contributing half the state's income tax revenue.
yeah, and if you look at sort of the distribution, part of that would likely be related to the amount of financial support that's being provided at the lower end, because you can see that, again, the amount of taxes on aggregate paid by under 25,000 is actually negative, almost $11.5 million. So, substantial amount of
I think we could look at this
Financial-
tax and say, fair is indeed in the eye of the beholder. And some people are not contributing at all. Some people are contributing a lot in hard actual dollars. If that's a fair amount, I don't know. But the,
I mean, it does show that the tax code is definitely constructed in a way
Yeah.
through decisions made in the legislature to tie it, very closely as much as possible to ability to pay, right?
so we have a little over 1,000 millionaires, right?
Tax returns
Tax
that report of
Yeah, all right.
an income.
And they.
And one thing that is interesting about some of those higher reporting income tax returns is there's actually a decent amount of churn in that population from year to year. It's not that you've got, 800 people who are very consistently earning $5 million every single year through their work. A lot of this is tied to things like realizing capital gains. I guess you win the lottery, so there's implications there.
Sell your Mantle
business.
rookie card.
Yeah. Sell your house that you've owned for 30 years and has appreciated tremendously over that time. So there's
Yeah.
definitely people that
Put me in.
are in and out of the bracket quite a bit. But
50%. Sure,
I didn't bring the percent with me,
but it's a large churn.
yeah. But with that said, there's also a large number of people that sort of hover,
Right in there.
right? Like some years they're a little over, a little under. Yeah, it's a relatively small slice of the population contributing a lot in income taxes. And this is looking at some of the same information, but I wanted to add one nuance here, and that is looking at tax returns where the primary filer is over the age of 65. So we were just talking about millionaires, right? So we've got about 1,000, a little over 1,000 of these returns, but almost a third of them are from our sort of either retired or traditional retirement age population. Not necessarily, these people age and sometimes they move or they pass, so it's not like I think of a way to phrase this. It's not like the meat of the
We're not
primary
gonna
work.
be here for another 50 years.
It's both a growing population in Vermont and at the same time, as you said.
Yeah.
And so, so they're about a third. You can see that as you come up the income spectrum, it's 65+ people are making up a relatively larger share of tax returns.
They are definitely making up the largest share of the poorer quadrant.
Mhm.
So we have, and I know Beth Pierce, she had numbers about people that were depending on their Social Security
Exactly.
as retirement. That was truly frightening.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I think why we've tried to give so much tax support there. That also maybe some of those people are living in houses that in no way could they afford to buy right now. So something to be aware of as we look at what we're doing with income sensitivity and property values.
Yeah. So again, looking at just AGI, so just income within this group, like we see in the number of total returns, large portion of the AGI that's making up this lowest bracket here. But again, after that, you see it increase over time so that they're making up a relatively larger share of our highest earners and contributing a relatively higher share of overall tax collections to the state. So while it's a growing population now, eventually over time, it's going to shrink. Just sort of highlighting that in terms of, one thing we always like to make sure people are thinking about is sustainability over time of certain tax decisions. And again, you see the similar type of trend here when you look at the amount of tax that they're actually contributing, 30%. Again,
One of them leaves, it's going to cause a bigger ripple than if one of me leaves. Because it will be a larger amount removed from total revenue. You know, I mean, if somebody in that middle bracket moves to Florida, you're not gonna notice it very much. 100 people do, but if you have one or two in that top bracket, go, it's gonna have a much larger impact on total revenue that's collected.
And there's even a wide variation in that top bracket.
Oh,
There's like a top 50 that
yeah.
are like, no, I moved the needle.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. We could probably make a guess as to who some of those are,
Probably
but,
know the names, yeah.
it is a small state. That's why they can't tell us how many people are in that top bracket. But yeah, okay.
Well, so thank you, Madam Chair. This, it seems like we're relatively informal, so I'm surprised at that number of the over 65s in the 0 to 25,000. I don't know why I'm surprised, but I am. Can we assume that those folks are living exclusively on Social Security? And that they don't have much in the way of savings?
I can't tell you the answer to that right now, but I do have ways of estimating some of that. If you'd like me to track some of that down.
It's just an interesting amount of people in such a small state, and I think it would tell an interesting story of
But you look at
how they got there.
where the majority, you know, the numbers in that smaller bracket, the biggest one is definitely the 50 to 75,000. That's your not quite middle class, or what was your middle class. Probably those middle too. But this has always been a poor state. And if you're making $25,000 a year, your ability to save very much is pretty limited.
I think that range right there is actually right about where the state median income sits. So, meaning 50% are earning less, 50
As an individual, I think it's around 56,000 for individual.
Okay.
They are paying taxes.
At 56?
No, I think you meant the 25 stuff.
And then
Oh, right.
56.
Their aggregate amount is, more money out than the state.
No.
they're paying property tax and all.
Pay all the regressive.
Okay. So that's a chart we should keep in mind as we play with other tax numbers, because this is just the income tax, which is our most progressive tax. Property tax could be progressive or regressive, depending on the individual.
Yep.
So in the first document I submitted, that's, we've gone through the structure, some recent changes and some of the numbers. I'm not sure what your preference is next. I know you wanted to ask maybe a couple of questions about a surtax.
I had,
And then just quickly, Julia is also here because I guess the two of you would maybe remember from the Education Income Tax Task Force or Study Committee.
yes,
We updated some slides from that, so I don't know if that's specifically what you're hoping to talk about, if you want to talk about surtax, which
Well,
I can.
this
Answer
is my
questions.
latest rendition from a constituent, a group of constituents who said it would be simpler and fairer if we did an income tax for education. And I know when we did the study, 60-some, high 60%, 2/3 is pay based on our income, in that there's a level that you're capped at, level of your income. That means those taxes are being paid, they're being paid by everybody above that income level because it raises the tax rate. But I know one of the questions was, well, if we're all paying X%, then if the rich people paid that same percent, we could fund our schools with no problems. And I'm just wondering if you looked at that top tax, and actually, they're looking at people at 500 and over as rich, not comfortably middle class. If they paid the same rate, if we did a surcharge on their income and they paid that much more, and I'm not clear if it would be that much more, and we do away with their property tax, or if it would be on top of, but if we just did that surcharge, what would we generate on those votes? How much money?
So what I looked at is actually, last year there was a proposal in the House to create a new top bracket that would apply. There's a few different things that were looked at. One was 3% on AGI above a certain level, which,
Yeah.
you know, that is sort of an entirely separate thing from what we just walked through in terms of the how the income
Right.
taxes work in the state. So then the other thing was, okay, let's look at let's just build a new bracket within the existing system because, you know, we're building off of something that already exists. So what I did yesterday actually was I went and looked back at how that was set up in the House, which sounded most closely related to what you were asking about. So essentially, if you added a 3% higher top marginal rate for income starting at 500,000 from what married filing jointly, and then so for married filing separately, it'd be 250,000 above, sort of increasing each top marginal bracket for each filing type by proportionally the same amount. So 3%, if we updated that for this year, what I was getting to was about $87 million in additional revenue.
Okay, and I think we know we're putting 70 to $100 billion a year into just buying down the tax rate, the tax increases. So 87 million might generate enough to buy it down for 3 years in transition, but it's nowhere near enough money to fund education and lower everyone else's property taxes.
Can you just repeat what you said again? I'm sorry.
No,
I kind of had a little, I want to make sure that I heard you correct.
Okay, so basically the proposal that I updated from last year was creating a new top bracket, just bolting it onto the existing tax structure.
Okay.
And so,
so you'd only pay it on that portion of 500,000 and up,
yeah,
filing jointly, or 200 singly.
and
You wouldn't,
so in a sense, what you'd be going from a top marginal rate of 8.75, which we have now, to a top marginal rate of 11.75, so 3% higher on income in that new bracket. And so what that proposal was that I updated was, so if you're married filing jointly, the income over 500,000.
Okay.
If you're married filing separately, over 250,000.
Okay.
For single people, it'd be above 410,000. And then for head of household, it'd be above well over $455,000. So just that marginal income above those levels under that proposal would have been taxed at 3% higher. And so what I talk about when I say 87, it's really just the delta between if you just left all that income tax at 8.75 and just that income, just accounting for the additional 3% for the new higher rate. That's where I'm getting the 87 million from.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. This is more to you, actually. And I hope Senator Chittenden's listening. That amount of money would be a great kickstart to a school construction special fund.
yeah, I mean, that, if we were going to do it, I think there is a lot, seems to be belief out there that if we did an income-based you know, if everybody paid a flat percentage of their income, and all 2/3 of us do pay a percentage or are limited to a percentage of our income. So if we did the same percentage above that, that we would make enough money to reduce everyone else's taxes. And because what's this whole tax bill,
Yeah, so
I mean, what do we spend on education? It's in the B's, right?
2.5.
yeah,
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's, you know, that's a government's job to pay for education and it's an
Yeah.
important expenditure. So,
but I don't think what Patrick is talking about is the proposal that's out there.
Okay.
I mean, the proposal that's out there is, my understanding, is a more comprehensive income-based revenue system for education, not just a surcharge.
But it
on
would
operating
have to
income.
be over and above the income we have now. So it would have to be some form of surcharge. If everybody is paying a surcharge of 3% based on your property values, if we did a 3, maybe that's what you could calculate. If we're all, you know, if we just took the total taxable revenue in the state and did an additional 3% on that, would that generate enough money to run the education system?
So I'm sure there's gonna be some nuance here that by
there
Julia
always
to
is.
interrupt me on, but just to try and understand a little bit what you're specifically asking me here. It sounds like the whole taxable universe, 3%.
Yeah.
It sounds like basically just adding 3% on top of each of the existing brackets. Would that be fair way to describe
Yes,
this?
I think, I haven't seen anything that's fleshed out to that extent, but what I heard when we were doing the income-based study was, well, we all pay X% of our income because, you know, you can only pay that much, and in those lower income, you know, property tax brackets, you're limited by your income. If people in that upper group above, what is it, 125, we stop ramping it out. If we just extended that, and I know Julia did the printouts for that, but if we just said everybody will pay, then those upper income brackets would pay enough to relieve the pressure on the lower. We couldn't figure that out. Okay, we've got one here, yeah. Implement a 3% income tax surcharge on Vermonters making over 500,000. That's what we just did, 87 million. We have not been able to find out about second homes yet. And I have not gotten my bill back. And we don't have time, but the House spent good portion, if not most of last year, trying to figure out how to tax wealth. They failed. There is a reason why no other state, including the state that the representative who wants to do this represents, or the senator, has been able to do it, because they haven't, we are generally, what is wealth? Is it your baseball card collection? And things, it isn't worth anything until you turn it into cash.
But I think also, did we hear in one time some testimony that
Tom's got his hand up. Okay, go.
basically one of the biggest things that contributes to wealth, depending on how you define it, is your biggest asset is often your home. And so arguably, that's kind of what we're doing in a way. I mean, we could tweak that, but a property tax is somewhat of a wealth tax because that's the biggest asset most people
It's a
have.
specific asset tax.
Yeah, it's a specific asset tax, and for most people, that's their biggest asset.
But a lot of the assets, if you want to say who has large assets, the large assets are in cash, in bonds, and securities, and art, and other kinds of things, some of which can be captured and counted, but much of which could be, which is the problem that a lot of folks who've tried to find wealth tax in other states haven't been able to
Right,
do effectively.
exactly.
And we weren't either. I mean, I can have assets in the stock market today and a week from now, they might be worth almost nothing or a tenth of what they're worth today. Or they might be worth more. So how do you value that?
We do.
Well, I want to give Senator Shannon a chance if
Yeah,
he wants to
no,
hop in first.
Got him next.
So I was going to actually echo what Senator Hardy just said, which is property tax is the form of wealth tax that we have in this country. We are taxing wealth with it, and it's very complicated to do. But we established this system over generations of time because we realize that properties benefit from schools being in their communities the same way they benefit from police stations and fire stations and roads and municipal services. So I as the advocates have tried to press for shifting away from the property tax, I pushed back in saying that a strong tax formula for a state is a three-pronged stool, one from property taxes, which is the only form of wealth tax we have codified through generations of agreeing to how we assess that property, then income taxes, and then use taxes. So I'm hesitant to even entertain the notion of not drawing from that one revenue source, which is rational in what all the other states do, because there is value in having schools in communities. But the other thread of this conversation, which Senator Gulick was chiming in on, as I am not opposed to, when it comes to the 1,049 people that make $1 million or more a year in Vermont. Those the couple of them that I've met are very generous individuals, and they are ready to contribute. They just want to know what it's going to go for. And so in my mind, if you tell them that this surcharge temporary is going to fund the building of new schools, heck, we could even name it after them. There's only 1,000 of them. We can put their names on the schools, is what I'm saying. I'm just saying, I think that's an open conversation I'm ready to have. To look at those making the most in Vermont and seeing if they could help support funding new schools to get us to a better track. But those are all I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, I think wealthier people will contribute to a good cause. They definitely, we heard when we were not putting the charitable contribution in and did, that they are a major supporter of the arts and culture and everything in this state. And I think that would be a source we could look to for, I thought, for flood relief coming out of that, but for a specific purpose for a specific amount of time. I don't have any reason to think there is enough money there so that we can reduce everybody else's tax burden and fund our schools.
Yeah.
It's not there. And
So Senator Matos and I were in House Ways and Means. I'm not sure how many days of our lives we're not getting back that we'll talk about. And it's, I think, I don't know, maybe everybody does or doesn't. The House passed out a higher tax last year, 3% over 500,000. Senator Matos and I could not vote for that. Came over here and it was basically DOA. It was for housing at that point.
That's right. Those came, everything did not go through the appropriations process.
And the reasons why it was DOA have not changed in 12 months.
It did go through appropriations.
It never gained any traction over here.
Well, I mean, I know there were lots of,
It never came.
there were lots of issues with it, but wasn't one of the main issues, the thing that Senator Brock was talking about is that the sort of.
No, that was the wealth tax, and Randy talked about that.
Oh,
This
wait,
was the
what?
high-
They never.
That never
Oh,
went,
I'm
those
sorry,
are the things that were
sorry.
like, we get that.
This was an income tax.
This was just the high earners tax,
I see.
which is, I mean, administrable, but.
Yep.
You know, the reason why I don't think it ended up going anywhere were, one, there was, you know, I think from the, general fund side of the house, they were like, income tax is our only large tax capacity. Why would we give it up to a different fund that is growing very, very fast? And, why would we give up that tax capacity? Then the other reason was just the, you know, you can raise the rate 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know, whatever. But is there really any tax capacity up there? You know, how many people do you lose? I mean, I know that the 2 wealthiest people I know in this state, just based on the conversation last year, one of them moved to New Hampshire, the other one stuck everything in treasuries.
Yeah,
We get nothing
That's-
from those 2
that's-
people now.
That's an anecdote.
Okay,
Well, it is.
there are 2
but-
forbidden topics in
Yeah.
this committee.
Oh,
One is whether or not the Holiday Inn would get built in downtown St. Albans or anywhere else,
Oh.
if we did or did not have a TIF. And the second one is whether or not people will move in or out of this state if we raise the top tax rates. Because
Yeah.
in my experience, 20 years sitting here, you believe what you believe.
that's true.
And
But my
the
only
truth
point
is probably sitting in the middle of the table.
My only point is that just because you raise a rate
Right.
doesn't mean you're gonna get an increase in revenue.
Right.
Or the increase that you expect.
I mean, and before, you said the word, which is capacity.
Yeah.
I would bet that better than half the legislature, I know better than half of the legislature has not been here during an economic downturn
Oh,
where
10%, that's fine.
you are sitting there taking a hatchet to the safety net.
Yeah.
That's gonna be next year.
Well, I was gonna
And
say, we're probably heading to one right now.
we could be, or we could be heading into the federal government taking a hatchet
That's
to
what
the
I mean,
safety
yeah.
net.
Don't know.
Or we could potentially see an economic crash and a hatchet. And anyone that has been through one of those downturns knows it is extremely painful. And that if you have used up all your taxing capacity, you don't have it to draw on when you need it in an emergency. And I think that was why all those tax bills never got taken up. They never came to this committee, was because they bypassed the appropriations process, which is where you say is housing where we want to spend that 3% surcharge.
The other issue is balance in taxation. We've gone through this several times before. The most obvious is the Blue Ribbon Tax Commission. It was done somewhere around 2010, 2011. Because the notion is we have this tendency, we keep doing it over and over again, is we take one tax and we tweak it, we raise it, we change it without taking sufficiently into account the follow-on effects it will have on our other major areas of taxation. If you don't do it all at once, it's bound to fail. We learn this over and over again. If we
We've done
make radical
everything but
changes,
sales
one or the
tax.
other, it will have a follow-on effect.
The other recommendation we haven't done is that we lower the sales tax. We spread it over services, which allows us to lower the rate, which helps us with our competition with our neighbor to the south and east or east. But that one never got done.
And it never got done because of a lack of trust.
Yeah.
Because everybody says that, well, we know what Vermont will do is a lower tax rate will then fall. And then somebody will come in and say, well, if we only raise another quarter point next year, we can do A, B, C, and D.
Yeah.
And suddenly in 4 or 5 years, you're back to where you were before, but you're taxing everything at that point. There's a lack of trust
And it's like if
for good
if
reason.
we cut our property taxes, there is a good chance, because there is so much unmet need at the local level, that you will see your local, and this will especially hit the small cities. They run services, they have the highest property tax rates.
Madam Chair, if I can offer, so the other document that I brought, it is fairly specific to the Education Income Tax
Okay.
Study Committee, in the context of that committee. If you'd like, it talks about the two tax types within what we call the, pillars of a high quality tax system.
Okay,
I'm happy to pull that up and start walking through it.
yes,
I just will point out it'll be a bit of a time investment.
okay, well,
If you're happy to. do
anybody
that.
that needs to go, feel free to leave. Yeah, I know you have a committee conference at 3:30. But I'm looking out the window. It seems to be falling, but not sticking on the windshield.
You do walk outside, be very careful. There's lots of people slipping outside.
Yeah.
It's completely rude.
Yes.
No.
I'm also happy to come back if you want
I
to continue.
I think it would be helpful.
I do too.
It's good. I'm looking at your
They're not
slides.
running out the door.
I wasn't suggesting
So-
that. Trying to accommodate.
The roads seem to be just staying where they were. It keeps falling, but it keeps melting. Yeah,
No, I'm fine.
okay.
Are we gonna take a quick little break or should I?
Why don't we
break
take a 10-minute break? Can we do that?
Sounds good.